Hello, welcome to my video on the balance of payments. Sorry it's been a while since I made the last one. I had a cold and didn't want to make anyone feel ill with my croaky voice. Also apologies if you can hear the football in the background. Watford's playing, so of course it's quite high tensions. We came across the current account back at AS. It is the part of the balance of payments that records the trade in goods, which is visible exports minus visible imports, the trade in services, which is invisible exports minus invisible imports, net investment income, which is sort of interest, profits, dividends and stuff from abroad, and transfers, mainly government transfers, for example, to the EU or in aid and that sort of thing. The capital account will probably be more new to you. It basically records capital flows in and out of the UK. So we've got short-term capital flows and long-term capital flows. So in the short term, it's stuff like hot money, which is volatile capital movements in foreign exchange markets because people are being speculative about how money's going to go. They want to make money, so they put this hot money in. And it's called hot money because it moves about very quickly as people change their opinions, as markets change and that sort of thing. In the long term, we've got two main areas. So we've got net FDI, which is the acquisition of overseas productive assets by UK firms. I think we came across FDI at GCSE and possibly last year as well, so you're probably familiar with that. And then portfolio investment, which is the acquisition of overseas financial assets by UK firms. A balance of payments equilibrium is what we get when exports are equal to imports, and we haven't had that in quite a long time. I think we've been in a balance of payments deficit for, forever, or for a very long time. Very interesting in the run-up to the election right now. I hope everyone's getting ready to vote if you're old enough. Basically, look out for politicians mixing up the deficit and debt. Deficit is the yearly thing. Debt is the long-term thing. So national debt might have doubled under the Tories, but they say they've cut the deficit every year. So it's two different things, and also obviously politicians lie all the time. So that sort of thing. Capital flows have grown quite a lot since back in the day. When I say back in the day, I mean 19th century, and not 19th century, 20th century. They've probably grown since the 19th century as well. And this is good and bad for different reasons. So it's great because it promotes the growth of world trade. Obviously, world trade and globalisation has its benefits. It allows firms to produce more, larger markets, reach their MES, more efficiency, that sort of thing. I think we come on to that in a bit. Nope, maybe not. We did it last unit with globalisation. Second one is finance for firms unable to get it in its own country. So you might be a firm that really wants to grow, you think you've got loads of potential, but no one in your country is either willing or able to give you that money, that investment, or because there's lots of capital flows and it's easy for money to be transferred from one country to the other now, lots of firms are able to get funding where they might not have otherwise been able to have it, which is obviously beneficial because it increases competition, more efficiency, that sort of thing. And that's the last one. Increased efficiency, and part of that is also due to the transfer of technology and ideas between countries, because stuff is much easier to transfer now, so that leads to greater efficiency and greater world output, and hopefully rising living standards for everybody. Unfortunately, there are costs of the increase of capital flows. One of those big ones is interdependence. I think there's a saying which I've probably repeated about 5 times over this little series, but when America sneezes, the world catches a cold. It's a really big one. Now that capital flows are going all over the place between countries, there's lots more potential for recessions to spread. So, for example, we took on quite a lot of bad debt from America, and then we had our financial crisis, which was partially fueled by that bad debt. And if we hadn't had the ability to transfer capital and debt and stuff across countries, across borders, that sort of thing, we wouldn't have got in such a difficulty. On the bright side, independence also means that good times spread as well. So if there's lots of demand in one country, or you're experiencing a downturn, you might be able to sort of fuel your way up to a better economy through using their demand for your goods and services to build and lead to multiplier effect and that sort of thing. Second cost is MNC domination. That's bad for sort of two things. One thing is because lots of MNCs means that smaller companies, domestic companies, are much less able to compete, so that might lead to local unemployment and deindustrialization and sad stuff like that. Also, MNCs being big is quite bad because it can lead to exploitation. So, for example, people in third world countries might be exploited by MNCs, and I believe we come on to that at some point as well. I think we did that in the last section. I'm sorry, I'm really all over the place today. And finally, destabilisation, and this is destabilisation of exchange rates, current accounts and domestic economies, especially due to hot money. If there's large sums of money being transferred across continents and that sort of thing, it can be very, very difficult for bankers and stuff to keep up, for governments to put in place appropriate monetary policies. If you think about how it takes 18 months to 2 years for a monetary policy to come into impact, if governments and people that are deciding monetary policies for different countries haven't had time to consider the hot money, haven't had time to realise it's coming in, going out, that sort of thing, it can lead to serious issues with getting your policies right. Moving on to financial services, the financial sector. Oh, look, Watford just scored. Financial sector in the UK accounts for 10% of UK exports, which is quite useful because we've got a balance of surplus, like a balance of trade surplus in services, although this is massively sort of overridden by the balance of trade deficit in goods. Also, the financial sector in the UK employs over 1 million people, which leads to more employment and a rise in real income and living standards rising and that sort of thing. So the financial sector is definitely an integral part of the UK sort of system, although it does provide lots of issues. For example, at the bottom here, we have our bankers with their massive paychecks, our fat cats as such, and these fat cats can lead to massive distortions of income, massive income inequality and that sort of thing, because lots of them got bonuses even during the financial crash, which is a bit out of order, I think, when lots of people at the bottom getting laid off and these bosses are being paid more and more and more. This is more of a Unit 3 thing, but it's quite interesting to note that there's a massive difference between one person getting paid, say, £10,000 and 10 people getting paid £1,000 each. The theory of thrift means that people who are less paid, if they get an increase, they're much more likely to spend the extra increase they get, whereas people at the top, if they get an increase, they're much less likely to spend it, so they're more likely to just put it in the bank and leave it to rot or something. So it's important to restrict inequality to a certain extent to ensure that demand stays in the market. So if we have wage increases, make sure they're all across the scale, so definitely with people at the bottom seeing increases as well. Plus, just in the name of fairness. Interestingly, back to the election, Labour has said they're going to increase the national minimum wage to £8 per hour, I believe. So that's just something to consider. Obviously, there are issues with increasing the national minimum wage because it can lead to issues where people get made redundant, they're unemployed because a firm can't afford to keep employing lots of people on minimum wage. So there's just lots and lots of different ways of looking at different situations, and it's really important when you're writing your essay to take all these different approaches. Though I think I've gone off on a bit of a tangent there because there's absolutely nothing here to do with the minimum wage. I'm just getting in a strop about bankers. Moving on now to fixing a current account deficit, and the first thing to think about is why is there an issue with having a current account deficit? Well, there's two big reasons. There's an outflow of money, which is a withdrawal from the circular flow of income, and that was that section I really hated in Unit 2 last year, AS Economics. So if there's a withdrawal from the circular flow, that leads to a reduction in national income and then negative multiplier effect as people have less and less money to spend, leading to unemployment and all kinds of horrible things. Secondly, competitiveness. Having a deficit implies a lack of international competitiveness, and in the long term having a deficit is really bad because it leads to deindustrialisation and unemployment. If we're importing loads of manufactured goods and services, it means we're not producing them here. If we're not producing them here, then people, A, who are working in those industries are going to get unemployed, and B, we're going to have loads of derelict factories and horrible stuff like that. There's different reactions to fixing a current account deficit if you've got a floating or a fixed exchange rate. With a floating exchange rate and a current account deficit, the exchange rate will respond to market forces by itself. So the exchange rate will fall if you've got a deficit, so price of exports will fall and price of imports will rise, and that will lead to a reduction in the current account disequilibrium as you become more price competitive on the international market. So it will basically do it all by itself to do with demands for money and stuff. This is because if we're importing more than we're exporting, we're putting lots of demand on other currencies, so we're selling our pound sterling to buy in euros or dollars or whatever, which is increasing the supply of sterling on the international market, which is bringing the price of it down, so it's depreciating the exchange rate. So naturally, over time, if you've got a floating exchange rate and a current account deficit, your deficit is going to decrease. I think Friedman talked quite a lot about this in one of his books, Capitalism and Freedom. There goes the washing machine. Vroom, vroom. I don't even know if you can hear it in the background. It was just being loud and annoying. With a fixed exchange rate, the exchange rate obviously can't help. The country can, over time, try to weaken its exchange rate to make it more competitive, but that can take a very, very long time. So countries with a fixed exchange rate, notably China and India, will struggle if they have a current account deficit. They've got to try to increase their competitiveness in another way, perhaps non-price competitiveness with branding and more effective quality, or try to reduce the price as much as possible, maybe extra investment in education and training, and attempts to increase productivity like that. Now we need to look at policies to control the deficit. So the first thing you could do is expenditure reducing policies, which reduce consumer spending power. So hopefully they're going to spend less on imports. So one of them will be fiscal and monetary. Obviously we've looked at fiscal and monetary policies before, but this will be anything that will be constrictionary. So fiscal policy might increase income tax, preferably direct taxation, I think, would restrict income most. And then monetary is the other one. So that's increasing interest rates, really, to stop spending on imports. However, the thing at the bottom there says consumers have a high marginal propensity to import, which sounds really posh, but basically means they spend a high proportion of any increase in income on imports. So even if we do, cut their spending power, they're still going to be importing. They might actually just cut their domestic spending, which would be a serious issue for the economy. The second one is expenditure switching, which is basically encouraging consumers to buy domestic rather than import. I mean, some things you could do is just have the whole buy British bug, get everyone into British things, British flags everywhere. I remember Hovis. Oh, look, Hovis, even now, it's got the Union Jack flag on it. Is it called the Union Jack flag? I'm really worried. Yeah, I think it is. And I really want some bread now. But that's got the Union Jack flag on it, so people think, oh, that looks pretty, I want to buy it. So that sort of thing can encourage people to buy domestic, but the other things here are much more wide scale, much more likely to have an impact. So the first one is direct control, such as protectionism. Protectionism is useful because it stops people from importing because it's cheaper to buy domestic goods and services, but you've got to remember it doesn't actually solve the problem in the long run. It doesn't solve the fact that you're less competitive. It just leads to higher inefficiency in the world because ultimately other countries are going to retaliate. Plus, protectionism, as I'm sure you saw in the globalisation section, has many serious issues for both the home economy and economies abroad. The others are devaluation and depreciation. Devaluation is weakening fixed exchange rate, and depreciation is weakening the free floating exchange rate. So those are two different things you can do, whereas devaluation is one you can control, whereas depreciation is much harder to control, although you can attempt to control exchange rates with interest rates, and I'm sure we'll look at that in the exchange rate unit, which is next, I believe. It's important at this point to consider two things here. The price elasticity of demands of exports, which is the Marshall-Lerner theorem. If exports and imports are inelastic, devaluation isn't going to help. So if there is inelastic demand, people are still going to buy from abroad even if they're more expensive because people have a tendency to buy that product regardless of price. I think the Marshall-Lerner theorem we looked at before, but it basically states that for devaluation or depreciation to be useful, the PEDs, the combined PEDs of imports and exports must be greater than 1. The second thing to look at is the J-curve effect, and I've done a little J-curve diagram down there, and it basically states in the short term, devaluation leads to deterioration of the current account before it starts to improve. So the current account will actually get worse if you devaluate a currency, and then it'll get better in the long term. It gets worse in the short term because of short-term inelasticities of demand and supply, and it also takes time to alter import contracts. If you've got contracts with other countries and stuff, you might want to alter them if you've had a devaluation of your currency. In the long term, it can actually be inflationary as well if you devaluate, because it will lead to rising import prices and a risk of reduced price competitiveness. Although again, issues related to price competitiveness can also be weighed out. You could just say, look, there's less price competition, but there's more non-price competition, so qualities have increased and stuff like that. Yay, the last slide. It's about fixing a current account surplus. So first we've got to think, why is there an issue having a current account surplus? Firstly, we can't all have surpluses. Not every single country can have a surplus. It doesn't work like that. So some countries will always be in deficit if others are in surplus. And if a surplus is too big, other countries are going to retaliate and they're going to put protection up, which harms trade for everybody. So it's important not to have too big a current account surplus. Furthermore, if we have a current account surplus, that's going to lead to domestic inflation, because it's going to lead to an injection into circular flow. There's going to be lots of money and it's going to increase national income, which will increase demand, which is okay to a certain extent, but if there's no capacity to increase supply, we're just going to see demand rising and pulling up the price rather than pulling up living standards, and that will lead to demand pull inflation. If you were with me at AS, you'll remember the Keynesian curve that I drew with 3 aggregate demand lines along it, and a shift from AD1 to AD2 would increase both real output and the price level because it was on a flatter section of the curve, whereas from AD2 and upwards, maybe to AD3, that's along the straight of the curve, the vertical part of the curve, so it only increases the price level, not real output, which is obviously bad for an economy. Now let's look at policies to reduce or control the balance of payment surplus. We've got 3, and they actually all begin with R. So we've got the reflation of aggregate demand, removing controls in imports, and revaluation or appreciation. So reflation of aggregate demand. Basically, if we increase consumer spending on imports, that should lead to an eventual balancing out of the current account. So one way we can increase consumer spending would be through fiscal measures. So that would basically mean reducing income tax. And we could also use monetary measures, so that would mean stuff like reducing the interest rate, essentially. So if people have more money, or they feel as though they have more money, they're going to spend more, and due to the policies we mentioned earlier, the marginal propensity to import, the majority of this money will hopefully be spent on imports in this case. So then another thing you can do is remove controls on imports. So basically, if we have any protectionism in place which could prevent importation because it would raise the price of imports, we should get rid of that. And that will lead to more importing and therefore a reduced current account surplus, hopefully. Also, just good in general, because reduced protectionism means more efficiency worldwide, although it could lead to potential job losses for some domestic industries. And the final one is revaluation or appreciation. So revaluation is strengthening a fixed exchange rate, and appreciation is strengthening a free floating exchange rate. We also have to remember that it's the same as before, so the Marshall-Turner sort of theorem must still hold if we want to benefit, and we also might see a short and reverse J-curve effect, so the surplus could actually increase in the short term before it decreases in the long term for anything that we do with revaluation or appreciation. Woo, that's the end of the, I don't even know what section this is, the balance of payments section. So I hope you enjoyed it and it helped and that sort of thing. Join me next time for exchange rates. Sorry this wasn't great as a video, I'm a bit distracted, especially by the washing machine, which kind of disrupted me in the middle dishwasher thing. But oh well, best of luck with exams if you've got them coming up, and see you soon. Have a lovely day, bye.